What's happening,
You hear
Banks?
that dog? It's really loud
Yeah.
in here.
Like
Yeah.
it's having sex or something? The hell?
Oh, just the neighbor's dog barking at another neighbor or a passerby or at a squirrel. Who knows?
He's so funny. He has like this little ooh sound in
Arr, 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 arr. Retarded dog.
my dogs become really throaty and low, and they sound a lot bigger than they are. So
Right.
especially the girl that is the smallest one sounds like she is twice Alekos's size when she barks.
Wow.
Wow, 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 wow.
They want to scare people, yeah. Hoo, 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 hoo.
Yeah.
Monster creatures.
Yeah.
Well,
This
this
is
one,
like
from what you're saying, is the opposite. He's a big boy. He sounds like a little bit.
Like a seal.
Yeah.
that sounds so cute though. I mean, oh god.
Seals
Okay.
are aquatic dogs and bears are
Mhm.
caveman dogs. Everything's dogs.
Yes. Yes.
Hello and welcome to the Quackcast. This is Quackcast number 613. I am Ozone Ocean and with me is Tance and Baines. Hello.
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 So we're all together for this Quackcast. We had this little experiment with our Patreon video just before. I recorded on my phone to try and get a better quality, and it was interesting. It was a fun little thing. I'm still reeling from my little experiment, so bear with me, people. So this week we're talking about the 1930s and what an influence it had on pop culture and everything in general for all sorts of reasons. But before we get into that, I've got to bring up the featured comic. Featured comic was a feature I featured this week, so I'm going to tell you about Nocturne 21, Volume 1, now. Hello, I'm Ozone Ocean, and my feature for the week was Nocturne 21, Volume 1. A blood-soaked boy collapses in the pouring rain and lies in the street dying. No one helps him. A passerby is shocked and rushes to his side. Seemingly recognizing the boy, he's galvanized to action and carries him home to care for him. For some reason, he eschews calls to take him to the hospital. There's a lot of mystery here, not least of which is the identity of the dying boy. Not even he knows. This is a great action drama with marvelously drawn dark, gritty art. It's been 20 years in the making, and it was even featured already way back here in 2011. But since then, this is a whole new version, whole new thing. It's redone, new comic title and everything, new account, and it's been, totally redone. And that was so long ago that it's worth giving it another feature. It's a cracking read. Even the dialogue-heavy pages move along quite well. Warning, if you don't like blood, there are some views of wounds being stitched up. So have a bit of a look at Nocturne 21, Volume 1. It's a comic by Hirokari, and it's rated M for mature. And that was the featured comic, Nocturne 21. Alright, next up we have the featured music. This week, Gummalus has given us a theme to a comic called She Used to Be Fractal. So I'm gonna sort of talk about that. She used to be fractal. A quiet, chill-out, relaxing track to space out to and go zen. A slow cruise into nothingness, white on white. It's as clean as new glass and as smooth as a polished stone. Gummalus says of it, channeling my inner shoegaze spirit. So chill out and zen out into white, into nothingness, with the theme to She Used to Be Fractal. which used to be Fractal by Cartoon Adventurer, rated E for everyone. Check it out and see if it matches up to the sounds.
Right, so let's see. This is a weird topic. I don't know, it's a pet topic of mine for various reasons. I think for very, very strong reasons. Okay, so my formative years of being influenced strongly by pop culture was the 80s. Because I was at an age then when I was young. And the 80s just happened to be a time when everything was harkening back to the 30s. Like in pop culture. And fashion was being revived, and some other kind of aspects of design and stuff like that, architecture, product design, things like that were harkening back to the 1930s, which was, it's just a weird thing, you know, there's a bit of a space between decades, and then you sort of harken back to stuff that went before in a kind of a fixed period. And there's various reasons for that, but the way it was, the 1970s was doing the 1920s, and they were kind of being nostalgic for then, and the 1980s were being nostalgic for the 1930s. And so a lot of pop culture was featuring a lot of 1930s stuff, which sort of made its way into my little brain and gave me a lot of influence for, you know, my things that influenced me. So but the thing is, even though that's just a me influence, I think there's sort of like there was a much wider influence for all of pop culture in general, sort of going forward, even today, that had that, you know, picked up on that 1930s stuff from the 80s, and you still see it today, and it just kind of rolls on and on. So let's see, I'll give you an example of the biggest things from the 1980s that were doing the 1930s. Star Wars, that had massive 1930s influence, not only for the political kind of situation and all that kind of stuff that was portraying. I mean, obviously there was a lot of 1940s stuff in Star Wars, being the Second World War. That was, you know, it was doing that, but it was also copying a lot of very specific 1930s things. Like there was design elements and stuff like that that had that origin in the 1930s. All the uniforms and things from the 1930s. All the fascist kind of marches and stuff like that the stormtroopers are, that's 1930s. Then we've got the very existence of it, like it comes from the 1930s reels that people would watch of Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers, which is what it's totally based on. You know, the opening text crawls, all that kind of stuff, all comes from 1930s movies, sci-fi. So there was Star Wars. Another big one was Indiana Jones, the whole Indiana Jones franchise. So we had the Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, Temple of Doom. Those were the two big 80s ones. I think The Last Crusade came out in the 90s. I'm not sure. But, you know, even that still had solid 1930s kind of influence. So we've got Indiana Jones, then the Indiana Jones TV series, which was fantastic. No one remembers that, but you know, that was a big part of it, although that was sort of influenced
Wasn't
by
the one
earlier
with
things.
Joaquin Phoenix, with Phoenix or River Phoenix, or one of the Phoenixes?
One of the Phoenixes, I think.
Yeah.
But that was
It
sort of
was
set
really good.
during the First
little
World
bit
War. I'll go on.
that came over, the little bit that came over here was really, really high quality, considering it was a spin-off.
Yeah, it was fantastic. We had a lot of other TV series like Tales of the Brass Monkey. That again had that 1930s kind of influence. Fantastic TV series, really hard to find these days. Noir comes from the 1930s. That made a resurgence in the 80s, like with Batman. Baines, you were talking about that with Frank Miller doing the Dark Knight Returns, I think.
Yes,
And
that was
course,
very strongly I think early Batman in the 30s was kind of noirish. But then he went away and became lighter and softer, and Frank Miller brought him back to that kind of detective noir kind of character in the 80s with the Dark Knight
and
Returns.
famously brought to the silver screen with Tim Burton's Batman.
Yeah.
a lot of Art Deco imagery there, especially how Gotham is designed. It's not just Gothic; it has a lot of Art Deco in the decorations of the city, and certain, the lines are very austere and straight, and um, they have this very Art Deco-ish feel.
They do.
In that movie. So.
And that sort of retains into the whole Batman aesthetic ever since. I think it pops up in the comics, but it pops up very significantly in later Batman films. Not in the ones with Christian Bale, but in all the other ones before him. Sam Raimi, I think. No, I might be wrong. But yeah, anyway, it was in those films like with Val Kilmer and George Clooney, and we've also got in the cartoons, the animated universe. It all went all the way through there. Even till today, it's just fantastic. The gift that keeps on giving. So yeah. That's a good point, Tance. Neo noir, Art Deco, with a bit of Gothic in there. Beautiful.
And then that begat, we have all the other things. I guess, are we going into that later? But even today now, because maybe of those influences, which were influenced by the 30s, you have Sin City, also Frank Miller, to Hellboy, with the noir, and urban fantasy, which is like fantasy and magic and monsters mixed with kind of 30s, 40s detective noir. Oh, yeah. I don't know when that rose, but that's a sort of its own genre, to say the least, and it's a huge genre in fantasy still.
Yeah, it really is getting bigger and bigger. Yeah, the whole noir thing. So that sort of, I think, started in the 20s, but didn't really coalesce. I think it started in the 20s, like in literature, but it didn't really coalesce until the 30s when we've got it like the screen kind of version, and that gave it the look and the imagery.
Honestly, I think it peaked in the 40s, but the foundation is definitely in the 30s. But I do think the noir, as we consider it noir, has a lot more a 40s aesthetic. The 30s has a rougher noir feel, like less sophisticated, I would say, in a sense. That doesn't make it inferior. It's just like a precursor to peak noir, like Casablanca style noir. So yeah, but femme fatales sort of things originated there. Like certain tropes came from the 30s, like through and through.
Right.
Yeah, I had a bit of a think about the whole the detective thriller a while ago, and the classic male detective has his trench coat, fedora, has a specific look to him, and he has his Colt 45 automatic, these kind of things. And I thought, that's interesting. I wonder where that comes from. And I worked it out. Well, those stories started in the 20s. So those characters would have been ex-servicemen from the First World War, most likely, because the trench coat was something that was only was invented for the war, and it was called trench coat because they wore those coats in the trenches. I mean, that's where that thing originated. And the Colt 45 was their service weapon.
And everybody would make fun of them as hipsters then too.
But yeah, I think those characters would have been veterans of the war, and being a private detective would probably be the only job they would have gotten. So that's interesting to think about. Oh. So ever since, and you've seen the hard-boiled private eye, which has sort of continued as a trope, even though they're very anachronistic beyond the 1920s, maybe into the 30s, it still makes sense. But after that, it stops really making sense because the people who gave rise to that and the whole context behind the situation that created them didn't exist anymore, which is interesting.
Oh, so, yeah. That is interesting.
They have an interesting past to them. So there's a lot of foundational stuff from the 30s. So what are the other appearances in the 80s? Like I remember in like watching Xanadu. A lot of people hate that film for some reason. I don't know. I freaking love Xanadu. It's this fantastic musical with Olivia Newton-John. Gene Kelly's in it. It's just so cool. And in part of that, this artist gets obsessed by this building. And he puts it on, he does record covers, and he puts it on these record covers, and these bizarre, futuristic looking kind of, shapes, architectural shapes. And the Gene Kelly character goes, look, I know this place. This is this old club. And the plot revolves around him reviving this club and turning it into this thing called Xanadu. And those shapes that were, featured in the film are a real thing. That was like a gate, used to be a gate to like a wrestling place or something like that in Los Angeles, I think. And it was Art Deco, but it looks so far out and futuristic, like something you'd never seen on the planet before, because it's just something that has it's not a functional building. It's just purely decorative, but not decorative in the old kind of fashion with, like architraves and, the old neoclassical kind of stuff, with the pillars and all this. It's a kind of weird sci-fi kind of thing that was popular for the Art Deco look. And I thought, wow, that's a really great example of the bizarreness of the 1930s, that it just gave rise to the stuff that had never existed before and wasn't really based on previous ideas. And so that was so cool. So other architectural stuff from the 1930s were modernism. So modernism, we think of that as like Bauhaus and modernism, this modern architecture. But it's not modern at all. Really, it just comes from the 1930s and Frank Lloyd Wright and various architects who sort of created this pseudo-functional look. It's meant to look functional, but it really isn't. It's just decorative in a kind of very rectangular way. Very opposite to Art Deco, so it doesn't have all that superfluous decoration. It has its own, it pretends to be functional in every single way. And today, one of the biggest architectural movements is this kind of retro pseudo-modernism. Everyone thinks it's modern, and they look at their houses and they have their minimal kind of design in their houses, and they think, yeah, this is modern, this is 2022, but it's not really. It's just harkening back to 30s minimalist looks and 30s, pseudo 30s pseudo decoration and 30s modernism, which is an interesting thing to me, that people are ignorant of how old and anachronistic that is, really. So postmodernism revived it, because postmodernism was a movement that incorporated many movements in various ways. It's a very simple way of talking about it, but it sort of revived modernism again, which was as part of itself. So so that was a big thing, architectural.
Mm-hmm.
Go on.
Yeah, in speaking of taking from that, the 30s generally had this investment in aesthetics, even in things that were supposed to be simply functional. That, of course, it's not just the 30s. I think also the 10s and the 20s also did that. So they are simply continuing the idea that everything has to be aesthetically pleasing as well as functional. Like if you see some Westinghouse devices and machines and stuff, and if you see how bridges were designed and how buildings, as you said, were designed, they generally were not simply just there to carry out the function that they're supposed to be carrying out. They were supposed to also have at least some kind of decorative purpose, even though on a minimalist level, unlike the 20s and the 10s. They were more minimalist, and then you get the Art Deco sort of feel to everything. Just the building looks simple, but for example, the shutters, like the windows are curvy on the top, or have a very specific shape that is very unique to the particular building, and that is very 30s. Especially in Greece, we have that, like those blocks of flats that were built in the 30s and have not been torn down because we unfortunately destroy beautiful things over here. You will get to see, like you can tell which block of flats were built then, exactly because they look simple, but they have this poetry to them, like the way that the balconies are designed, the way that it looks like something that you would like to draw, let's say.
They're quite rounded on their edges and streamlined in a certain way. It's very notable in Thessaloniki in Greece. Northern
Absolutely,
Greece.
Yeah.
Especially near the water there. All the buildings along the waterfront are just beautiful Art Deco style.
Yeah. Thankfully, because it is like you are forbidden to tear down stuff there in that particular area. So it's like the historical center of Athens as well, where you also cannot tear down anything, and that's why you get to see those things there. So.
Yeah, well, they're quite nice. We do have remnants of it in Australia as well in various cities, but people progressively like to tear things down and build new stuff, unfortunately, which is a real shame because it's such a striking image and they have a real beauty to them that has not really been replicated. Because, yeah, as you say, it's the design style involved decoration, which is absent from later styles, or at least later styles when they had their decoration. It's pretending to be functional. Yeah, it's and unfortunately, because we had real world events like the Second World War and depressions and all sorts of things, what that meant was, and also improvements in material science, that meant that you could produce buildings cheaper, and you had to produce them cheaper for a lot of reasons, which meant a lot of decoration was then, out. So, yeah, there's various good reasons that they stopped doing that. Unfortunately. So, what are the other things from the 1930s that really became big? I mean, there's the hairstyles, women's hairstyles. They had the classic waves and things like this.
Absolutely, yeah. The shape that again peaks in the 40s, it starts in the 30s, like angular, austere lines. The skirts become like sort of like pencil almost with flares, and so you have straight lines that give into curves in fashion, at least in women's fashion, which is something I really like as an aesthetic. Men become bulkier, as you said.
Yes, wider suits with wide shoulder pads. Yeah, unfortunate. I mean, not all the 30s outfits were like that for men, and there had been, like when I say wide shoulder pads, the shoulders were quite wide, but then they cut in very strongly at the waist.
Yes.
And then
yeah, so you have the inverted triangle going really, really strong. It's not really bad. I mean, it makes you stylish for sure. Like it cuts a very sharp figure. Whether you like it or not, it attracts the eye. So.
Yeah. And it was not like, say, the modern idea, which is rather unbalanced, where you have a wide shoulders and then everything slopes down in a pyramid shape, inverted pyramid. Then you had the wide shoulders, they slope down to the waist, and then you go out again. So you had a bit more balance to the look.
Yeah. Of course, again, you have like the very super iconic shoes. Every decade before the war had super iconic shoes, women's shoes for sure, like the pumps. The shape of the heel was very, very characteristic. The dancing, 1930s dances, were very, very characteristic as well, like in the 20s.
I only know 20s dances. I don't know 1930s ones.
Well, it's not that they were this super new thing. It was just that they had a lot of movement and style, and like they had more flair to the way they danced certain things, especially ballroom dancing and stuff. Like they had the jive, the shag and stuff. Foxtrot was very characteristic as well, which I really like. By the way, Foxtrot is a very clever dance in the sense that it makes you move in a way that shows off everything you are wearing. Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, I learned the foxtrot back when I was in high school, years and years and years ago, but I cannot remember it now.
It's sort of you go a little bit like a shrimp, like a few steps backwards, and then you half turn and go forwards again. It's more or less like a backwards and forwards with your partner. Not like the cha-cha, but in that logic.
Okay.
And of course, you have the swing dancing. That was really, really big. Even in Nazi Germany, it was big, although it was prosecuted really heavily. And I know that because it's going to become relevant eventually.
Swing music, yeah, the big bands.
Yeah.
Glenn
Miller, for sure.
Benny Goodman.
Mm-hmm.
And much more.
Yeah, Nat King Cole.
I was just remembering some more 80s stuff that was influenced very much by the 30s. Let's see. The actor Kathleen Turner had very, very classic 1930s look. That was her thing. The series Moonlighting. So that was a classic 1980s TV series, but very 1930s in the way the characters had the relationship together. And, they were private eyes.
The whodunit thing, I mean, the genre, the whodunit genre, I would say, comes from the 30s.
Oh, yeah. And Moonlighting, of course, gave us Bruce Willis. Without that, he wouldn't be a thing.
So, yeah.
For sure.
You wouldn't have had Die Hard.
When was the Raymond Chandler canon of books, like The Big Sleep? Is that 20s or 30s, or is it later?
It could be 40s.
That's true.
Look it up.
It could be 40s, I was thinking, yeah. So maybe that's sort of an outgrowth of the...
Yeah. But
30s
even if it was, like you say, it would still be very much
I think
coming from
the books were set earlier than they were written, I'm pretty
sure. I'm looking it up now. 1939. There you go, Bones.
Yeah. Sorry, guys. I just thought it'd be
excellent.
Not 39, right on the cusp.
1939. Perfect.
And I think maybe it was set in the 20s. I could be wrong about that, but it's been a long time since I read it. But
yeah. But obviously very much informed by that, 1930s aesthetic and thinking and stuff like that. Yeah, awesome. So we had also the creation of the character Bulldog Drummond. Not many people know this. So this was like a British kind of superhero character. Well, not really a superhero. He was an insurance investigator, right? Which you think, oh god, that sounds freaking boring. But so he sort of solved plots and bad things that would happen. He was in a kind of James Bond way. So Bulldog Drummond is basically where that James Bond kind of character comes from. And also where The Spy Who Loved Me, what's his name? Mike Myers' character. For goodness sake. What's he called? Austin Powers. Austin Powers is based on Bulldog Drummond. So there we are. There's more stuff that's based on 1930s original stuff.
Yeah. And also there is a lot of, like, the 30s were highly political, and I'm not just talking about, the fascism and
fascism
the Nazis.
and communism and Nazis and
Yeah, you have and you have a lot of political classes, and you have a lot of social strife taking place. The 30s taking like the calling, let's say, from the 20s, of course, where a lot of working rights and human rights were basically established. We had huge strikes taking place, especially in Greece. It was like a war zone in the sense that we had such big demonstrations, for the 8-hour workday and a lot of things like that, like having, for example, an NHS or having pensions, like the right to have a pension because we didn't have that, and a lot of other things. And they were not just huge strikes. They were strikes that were suppressed with live fire. We're talking a really savage way of governments dealing with these things. So if anyone is interested, just look up 1930s demonstrations and stuff like that, and you will see that a lot of things that took place then were really, really wild in the cruelty that happened. But they gave rise to a lot of rights that we now accept as universal, never mind the fact that we are letting them slip through our fingers, but we still do accept them as universal. So there's that.
Yeah, they had those strikes in the United States, in Britain too, same, and probably many other countries. Yeah, in the United States they had people shot. That happened. So, well, we had the Great Depression, of course.
Yeah, and then again we have the Great Depression, which was a huge event in the sense that it marked people a lot more than we realize, just like we don't realize how the Great Recession is marking people right now as we speak, even though people think that it is in the past. It isn't, not yet, sociologically speaking. Back then again, we have at least two generations, two cohorts that were greatly shaped by the event of the Great Depression and went into World War II with completely different backgrounds. So, fascinating stuff. And I do think that this is reflected a lot in pop culture, in the sense that there is a very powerful element of politicization in movies that we may not have as much in, say, the 80s as much. Because the 70s, again, was a different era. There was a lot of politicization, again, in that decade, but the 80s, I don't think it had as much.
The 80s romanticized the image of the 1930s. They took all the imagery from it without a lot of the meaning it gave rise to, which is interesting.
Absolutely, yeah. So that I think that is very significant in the sense that the 30s were like an incubator of things that were taking place, and then you have World War II, of course, that came in.
Yes.
As a consolidation.
Cloud burst. But a lot of things that were like happening in the 1930s. Look at the British Raj. It was the last days of that. The British controlling their massive, because the British Empire was the most powerful empire in the world at that stage. America, if we think of America as being the great, enormous country, very
not back
influential
then.
country it was, but it wasn't. In the 1930s was the last time that that Britain was in that position. So they controlled all of India as well. This massive country. So the British were like this segregated high class within it, and there were the British Raj, which was various Indian people who were also sort of on that sort of higher tier, and all the other common Indian people below them. So yeah, that was the thing that was happening, and that all changed after the Second World War.
We have like certain countries weren't the thing back then. Like take for example Pakistan, since you mentioned India. It was not a thing.
And Bangladesh as well.
Was part of what?
Bangladesh as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Sri
Lanka. I mean, a lot of Southern Asian countries were really radically reformed after the 30s. So we could say that the 30s were a gateway between the older world and the newer world of modernity.
It was the last gasp of that colonial empire, but it wasn't even colonial. It was like pure empire.
Yeah, it was empire. Absolutely.
In
like for Greece was it was for like sort of half of it was a kingdom, and then the second half of it was a dictatorship. And so we're talking about, like, we went into the 40s and World War II with a frigging fascist dictator, like officially fascist, I'm talking about, not just we surmise from what they're doing that they're fascist. They were officially fascist, complete with Nazi salutation, like the hand thing.
Yeah.
Which is really freaky to look at now. But it is also a reminder that it had no stigma back then. There was no stigma for the swastika, the Roman style salutation, all of that imagery that right now is super negative. Yes, absolutely. Then back then they were as legit as the EU stars are now. It's absolutely okay to have all of that. And even accepted. Yeah.
There's that beautiful house, I think, that used to be owned by German archaeologist in Athens, and the front gate is all swastikas.
Yeah, it was by let me just my mind just froze right now because I'm still half tipsy right now. One second, I'm going to ask my mom. One moment. Okay, Sliman. It was a mansion.
That's the one.
By the guy who discovered Troy, and his name was Schliemann, and he had a real thing, I'm trying to put it elegantly, about swastikas, because swastikas were supposed to be the symbol of prosperity and power and prowess and, what have you. So and we still have this mansion because it is a very iconic 1910, 1920s sort of architecture. And it is full of swastikas. Even the gate has swastikas all over.
Yeah.
If you go inside, the floors are swastikas. There are swastikas on the ceiling. There are swastikas on the wall. Like swastikas forever and ever and ever. So yeah.
Oh dear. Yeah, it was a.
And yeah, when the Germans came as occupiers and they entered Athens and stuff, they fell in love with that particular building. So
I wonder why.
yeah, it
It's
was
a very popular
oh,
symbol in general in the 30s, not just for Germany, but a lot of countries in Europe were using it, like Finland specifically.
yeah.
Iceland, a lot of places they had it just as their normal symbol, which is weird. So yeah, it was a very common symbol for Germanic people and Northern Europeans.
It's very common symbol for pretty much everyone. I mean, we have had it as Greeks since, I don't know, 2000 years before Christ, like BC, whatever, before Christ. I cannot remember the modern way now.
Before Common Era, BCE.
Whatever, yeah, okay, that one. And you can see it in certain meanders that form it, and you can see it on Athena's, goddess Athena's clothes. You can see it very often, and it is generally a symbol of power and has been in ancient Greece. You have India that still uses it and has completely different connotations. I mean, it's a pretty abstracted and easy to create symbol. So, of course, it is everywhere.
Yeah, it's like the cross. It's one of these universal kind of symbols that a lot of people just use. Crescents as well. So let's see, what were some other 1930s things that are lost to the world? Ocean liners. They don't exist anymore, but that was the last kind of. Well, I mean, they did sort of carry on into the 1950s and 1960s and started to go away. But in the 1930s, they were really like it was a massive thing, ocean liners. And people might say, oh, but cruise ships are a different thing. So an ocean liner is called a liner because it went on the same line. So it was a transport. You know, like you get on a train, you get on an aeroplane. You don't go and visit everywhere on an aeroplane or a train. You just go from here to there. I mean, you might have stops along the way, but it's it's travel.
Zeppelins.
And that's what liners were. Yeah, Zeppelins were starting to like take over, and they were being a big thing. They were going to replace ocean liners, but only Germany really had mastered them. No one else had mastered them. People were
until it blew up.
Yeah, until the Hindenburg. But that was designed actually for helium. Germany didn't produce enough of it, and there was embargoes against them, I believe, because of the Nazis or whatever else. So they couldn't get the helium they needed. So they had to use hydrogen instead, which wasn't so great. But the Americans had their R models, I think, which were terrible. they'd be okay and they'd be great, and then there'd be a big storm and they'd end up upside down in the ocean or something like this. It was just terrible. The disasters that would happen with these bloody things. The British also had tried them, but no one could master them like the Germans could. Flying boats. So aeroplane technology for long distance travel was all in flying boats. So if you wanted to go great distances, you had to get on an aeroplane that would land in a body of water. So that was an amazingly different kind of travel. So you'd have like so obviously the range wasn't as good as it was now. You couldn't fly for thousands and thousands of kilometers. You could only fly for a few hundred, and then you'd have to touch down in a bay somewhere. So it could be like, a nice exotic bay or whatever. So you'd have to make provisions for that.
Another thing that we tend to forget is that in the 1930s, we were still in the pre-antibiotic era. We were just starting to get into, sulfas and And oh my God, penicillin
Penicillin.
was a huge invention that was first really used in the 1940s, and it was really rare, and that's a thing that we would address in plague resistance and all of that. Tuberculosis, for example, was a real big scourge. So you had the sanatoria
The
that where
iron
people,
lungs.
yes, iron lungs. Oh, polio. There was
Yep.
another thing. Like we had diseases that now we forget about, and they were very much something that people lived with. And we also did not know how to perform CPR at the time. So
Wow. So
if you
you
had
just
a heart attack,
die.
yep, if you had
Wow.
a heart attack, they would just tell you, please don't die, and then you would die. So,
Pat you on the back until you stop.
yeah, yeah. So that's also huge. Uh, we didn't have all these things that we now consider absolutely basic knowledge that everyone should have. It was not a thing. Vaccines were
Yeah.
only just starting to be widely a thing.
Yeah.
Insulin, another thing.
Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah,
Mhm.
it's quite a different place. Yeah, when you think about it, the change from the 1930s to the 40s and the modern era, I mean, which really begins after the 40s.
Mhm.
Like everything is different. You know, world communication was so much slower back then. You really
Mhm.
didn't know what was going on in one part of the world and another when it was happening. It would maybe a few days later or something like that, but
Yeah.
world was way more split up back then.
Mhm.
So
And
yeah, it was,
like for example, to give you an idea, even now in Greece, when you have a baby, the the thing that people wish to you, you are expect to hear is, "May the baby live for you," and
oh
and
yeah,
and that is because infant mortality in the 30s and the 20s and earlier, of course, but in the 30s it was really high because you basically had zero prenatal care as we know it now. You had minimal care for the mother during and after birth. The kid was exposed to a gazillion things. So it was very likely that the kid would not live. So that was why people were wishing for the baby to survive. And that is how one of the well wishers in Greece was established. So that's like if we consider like, we have remnants in our language, in the way we do things that come from an era that is alien to us, even though we think that it is fairly recent. Um,
so recent and so different. I mean, the whole idea of large families.
mhm,
The reason that went away was because childhood mortality was no longer
I
such
think
a big
as
problem
much.
anymore.
Mhm.
So that's why you, you have these grandparents and stuff like that with
Mhm.
I don't know, like three sisters and four brothers and all that kind of stuff. It's a culture
Yeah,
of having lots of kids because a lot of them wouldn't survive into adulthood. They would
absolutely.
not only die from, like infant mortality, you die from the problems of childhood, like, the diseases we were talking about, polio and tuberculosis and all sorts of things, or just falling over or getting an infection, getting tetanus.
Mhm. Oh
They
my God,
kill you
yeah,
back then.
tetanus was a huge thing as well. Or, I mean, any infection, if it got into your blood, you were done for. There were no antibiotics. There was nothing you could do. Um,
Dying in childbirth, that was another thing.
mhm,
So, so let's talk about um, some of the get off the grimmer stuff and talk about
mhm,
some of the pop culture things influenced by 1930s stuff or harkens back to it. Actually, funnily enough, today I was just watching Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, which was a fantastic Coen Brothers film. And that's all set in the 1930s.
Yeah, it's
And
the
it gives
Odyssey
you,
in the 1930s.
it gives you, it says it's based on the Odyssey, but it really just has, here's a bit of the Odyssey, here's a bit of the Odyssey in here, and then it remixes it in its own way without it being in the proper order or
Of course, yeah.
proper meaning. But yeah, that was great fun. The music's fun and everything like that, but it's based in the south of the United States in the 1930s. So that period during the Great Depression, they had the Dust Bowl, everyone's for closing on farms because of the droughts in Oklahoma and all that kind of stuff. So it's a terrible kind of degradation and poorness that you see in that film, which you don't normally get from stuff set in the 1930s.
There's also like a country and music and jazz that was really big at the time, and also chorus line stuff like musicals and big numbers. Those were in the 30s, like big musicals, big dance numbers with a lot of people.
Yeah,
That's
because
why I'm saying chorus line.
that was the rise of the talkie. And they thought, well, how are we gonna do this? Because films had been like, you'd have a little bit of action, no one could speak, and then you'd have a card saying what people were saying, and then you'd be back to this action, and just people playing piano and stuff like that in the cinema to give a bit of sound to it. But in the 1930s, suddenly you have the ability to have sound with the film all synchronized, which was incredible. So musicals
Sound
are a
of
great way to
Music
go.
is a great film about this transition, and it is also a musical.
Yeah, it's about the rise of fascism in Austria.
Oh my God! Yes, Sound of Music as well. But I was talking about Singing in the Rain. Oh my God! I
Okay.
really need to go rest.
Of course, yeah.
But yeah, I'm talking about Singing in the Rain more than Sound of
Gene
Music.
Kelly, fantastic actor. And Gene Kelly, one of these fantastic actors who really, made it big doing this. I don't know if he was around in the 30s, but he did stuff that was very influenced by it. He probably was.
Yeah, he was more like post-war, I would say, but definitely revived a lot of the vibe.
Yeah.
So,
And so he directly influenced Michael Jackson, who
yeah.
directly influenced so many artists after. Whatever you think about Michael Jackson, he was fantastically influential, and he was directly influenced by that 30s aesthetic and look. Look at the famous Annie, Are You Okay? Whatever that song is. Smooth Criminal.
Yeah.
There we go.
I think that is like one of the best dance videos I have ever seen and probably will ever see. Like it will always be in the top 5, in my opinion.
Which a lot of those moves come from Fred Astaire, but Gene Kelly as well. Just awesome.
So I really like. I'm not sure what the influence of this still is. Maybe you guys have an idea, but the 1930s is also the kind of heyday of horror movies, classic Universal monsters like Dracula, Frankenstein, and into the even late 40s, I think, is when they kind of ended. But they started at the beginning of the 30s, and they had this gothic kind of cloaks, horse and carriages, kind of medieval, but kind of modern also, I want to say. This sort of this gothic fantasy kind of setting.
I think that was because it was very much related to noir. A lot of play with black and white, a lot of play with suspense, and that sort of thing. But yeah, I would say that.
In the 1930s, they did still, in rural places especially, you'd still have horses and carts and carriages and things.
Sure.
That was definitely...
And they did tend to be set in kind of Europe,
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the myths of World War II is that Germany was this vast mechanized force and people had tanks and half-tracks and motorbikes and all this. But in fact, the majority of the German war movement was carried by horses in the Second World War and when it was in the beginning of the Second World War. So, yeah, even in Germany, the place celebrated for its mechanized troops. Horse and carts. So there you go.
Speaking of, I mean, the 30s were really a great inspiration for cinematography for the rest of the century, and that includes the Nazi propaganda films. Those were some really pioneering approaches to how to shoot certain scenes.
Leni Riefenstahl was amazing with her cinematography.
Exactly. Like if you have seen Triumph of the Will, which is like, it doesn't get more propaganda than this. I mean, anymore, and someone will crawl out of the screen with a swastika. But if you see it, I mean, personally, as a film, I find it boring because it's really a documentary about the Nazi celebrations, if I'm not mistaken, in Nuremberg. But I mean, it is about Nazi celebrations and then how Nazi youth go out and be supernatural and powerful and with prowess and blah blah blah. So beyond that, though, if you ignore the content for a while, for a bit, you generally see exactly how she is framing her material to make it larger than life, and that I think is something that really influenced filmography ever since, even if people don't want to acknowledge it, because she was a Nazi.
Definitely. I mean, that's another thing that influenced Star Wars. Like Riefenstahl, Nazi marches, all that kind of stuff. They took some of the little snippets of that for the Rammstein video stripped. They took bits of Triumph of the Will and used it in there, and it's fantastic, but without the Nazi-ness. That's stripped from it, ironically. But yeah, you're definitely right. 1930s stuff was very influential in the look of things. You know, like Bane said, with the horror movies and stuff like that. But also like these German cinema, like Metropolis. Oh, gorgeous film, and that's like wow, beautiful Art Deco stuff used in that. Just incredible.
And I would say it's a little bit unfortunate that we have Nazis in the 30s, in the sense that, you know, beyond, okay, we got our pop culture iconic villains. And if you want an easy villain, you get a Nazi and you're set. But they also are like a blanket for all of the other things that were going on during the 30s. And they make it really hard for people to see, for example, German philosophy during the 30s that was not Nazi endorsed, or counter movements, or what was happening with those that were, like what was happening with the communist movements, what was happening with the democratic movements. All of these things are just muted because we have the freaking Nazis. And if you think 30s, that's what everyone thinks in terms of politics. And that's really unfortunate in my opinion.
They go to the extreme. It's true. Unfortunately, we simplify everything. Those basic elements. But they do make good villains.
Oh, and
so many things.
better villains. I mean, I don't know how this happened. If
Indiana
we didn't know,
Jones.
yeah, if we didn't know they were true, we would not accept them in like they were real. We would not accept them in
True.
fiction as being too uh, cartoony. in a
Yeah,
sense.
they're very cartoony. We've got Indiana Jones, the Rocketeer,
Mhm.
which is another good one where they pop up. The Three Amigos. You have Nazi villains in that as well.
I mean,
That's
pretty
another
much,
great
if you wanted
1930s
like
thing.
a big, larger than life villains, Nazis were your thing, your go-to. You couldn't go wrong with those. Um, and then we also have like moving away from Europe. If we go and look into the Soviet Union, yeah, we have a, a huge um, eruption of arts and filmography there as well, which is something that again is not really looked at because Stalin, but beyond Stalin and beyond whatever you think about communists, you do have a lot of people in like behind the iron curtain or whatever uh, that created a lot of things that we are still using now in pop culture. Like for example, the one of the way to shoot um, single like unedited shots, long shots that go from the ground really high up before we had the drones. So
Yep.
that was a technique that was created by this Soviet director that I don't remember right now, unfortunately. I'm really bad with names. Um, and there were more things like this that were developed at the time. Um, that again we don't look at because we think of the 30s as this monoculture in the West and this monoculture in the East, and there was nothing else. But we like the feel and the aesthetic.
Yeah, we do.
Uh,
Sergei Eisenstein, is that who you meant?
I think that's him. I'm gonna just check real quick.
He did the famous Battleship Potemkin back in the 20s.
Yeah.
Very,
One
very
second,
clever,
I'll,
very influential with his...
yeah, I think that's him. He was awesome, and like take a Shostakovich for example. He was like a beast in music, um, really, really iconic and
Stravinsky as
powerful.
well?
Stravinsky as well. Um,
Oh, we had
even,
Gershwin back then. Oh my God, so many good
Mhm.
people.
Yeah,
Who's fanfare
absolutely.
for the common man? Copeland.
Hmm.
So here's another big one. So Copeland basically invented the sound of cowboy films. So if you
Hmm.
watch cowboy films from the, I don't know, the 50s, the 60s, all the way up to now, and there's a particular sound that they have. Copeland created all that. That was him. Just an amazing guy. The drummer from the Police. Yes, Fanes, it was him.
yeah, I thought so. Yeah, he was awesome.
Yeah, and we
Incredible.
also tend to forget that Charlie Chaplin was a thing in the 30s as well. Like he was really
Oh,
important, and he uh, actually made some pretty powerful stances, not only for like I'm not just talking about the great dictator that was so powerful and so prophetic, but also made other films that were a direct um, uh, criticism of society and where modernity was taking humans. But again, we forget this because he is the
the clown,
silent
yeah.
movie
The
star.
bum.
Yeah.
Interesting. We had a lot of very amazing, influential Jewish comic
Mhm.
actors who just went on to be so influential decades later. So Charlie Chaplin, British. We've got the Three Stooges. And those guys were in reruns all the way. So many kids grew up with the Three Stooges into the 80s and maybe into the 90s and further. The Marx Brothers. Just incredible. They made their best films in the 30s. That's where they really hit their stride. Just amazing. Baines, did you go up with the Marx Brothers and Three Stooges?
The Marx Brothers, no, but my dad liked the Three Stooges, which were, they were in reruns or in revival when he was a kid, I guess. But, but I knew of them via my dad. And I know of the Marx Brothers. I don't really know their stuff.
But so influential, and so many things from today sort of hark directly back to there. I mean, Three Stooges, you wouldn't have Jim Carrey at all as a force if it wasn't for Three Stooges. His stuff was totally based on them, not just from Dumb and Dumber, but all his physical comedy and the looks and stuff like that. So yeah,
Bugs and Looney Tunes and everything is 40s, right? Yeah.
But it had a lot of 30s humor and 30s references.
Betty Boop, though, isn't 40s.
Yes. Would be 30s. Okay.
Yes, good old Betty Boop. So there's a lot of controversy around her saying actually she was based... Well, the whole look of the character and the voice and everything, people say actually there was a black actress who pioneered that look. But Betty Boop really wasn't based on her. She was based on this actress called Helen Kane, I think, who sort of did the style. And I don't know if you could really...
I find that hard to believe that culture would be taken from the black community.
Never happened.
That seems... Yeah. I don't buy that.
Yeah, never. It has never happened, ever.
No, I'm thinking of it in the way that Madonna was very influential and everyone knows her look from the 80s and she had a particular look, but it was totally taken from Cyndi Lauper who did it before her. But people don't look at that as being theft. They just think, that was the style that was influenced. So maybe that was the thing with Helen Kane. Because she was just a cabaret performer. Just, doing a thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Betty Boop... Fantastic lady. And the great Cab Calloway.
Right.
This awesome singer who, we knew of him as little kids. We knew of him from Sesame Street. And his song, Hardy, 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 Ho.
Yeah.
Minnie the Moocher. And you listen to the lyrics of Minnie the Moocher, and it's basically about a prostitute who was using drugs. They used to sing about that to kids on Sesame Street.
Also, there's the 30s is really the rise of comics.
I'm glad you're saying
so. And still in the wild, I would say. I mean, they were being quickly brought under censorship and stuff in the 30s, but they were still wild and out there, comics for everyone and not necessarily for kids. And they were the big scare that this is the devil spawn again.
Well, comics were for adults basically in the 1930s.
Yeah, they were kind of for adults. Yeah, I do like this comic, Little Abner. I'm a fan of it. It's sort of nobody knows what it is anymore, but the cultural markers are still. It's funny, I saw the source of some things that my mom used to say just in conversation that she probably doesn't even know came from this comic. This thing was huge in the 30s and 40s and beyond,
Yeah, the no eyeball stuff.
That's somewhat of an Archie look to the characters, sort of. Oh, Brother, Where Art Thou? It has that kind of territory. It's about the sort of hillbillies and poverty, a lot of satire. About what was going on in the world and stuff like that.
So that was quite popular with a lot of people. The famous Robert E. Howard, of course, all his pulp stuff came from there. Conan the Barbarian is a 1930s creation, and also, but he also had this character called Breckenridge, who is very much Little Abner kind of thing, Baines. Like, if you can find a copy of the Breckenridge stories,
I think I've seen reference to that. I'll look into it. Yeah, it's
hilarious, and the guy speaks with such a hillbilly like patois. He has that kind of speech. It's just beautiful. It's Little Abner stuff. Yeah.
Okay. Nice.
Breckenridge. Just awesome. I think people have done comics based on it too. And it's probably out of copyright, so you could do your own comic based on Breckenridge. Oh. Please do.
There you go.
Yeah, it was a lot of comics came from there. And like we say, they weren't just childish ones. They were, for adults. And it wasn't superheroes, because superheroes were coming to be a thing. With Superman, I think was really... the Phantom actually was the first one. So the Phantom, The Ghost Who Walks by Lee Falk. So that was more of, he didn't have superpowers. He could sort of talk to animals and things. And that was really the extent of his powers. He was just a guy who wore a suit and had a couple of Colt 45s and punched people so hard with a skull ring on his fist that it would leave an imprint in their jaw forever. And then we had Superman and, Batman and all this kind of stuff. So there was the rise of that. But Batman, again, was sort of more like the Phantom in that he didn't have superpowers. So, yeah, that was the rise of comics. But we had a big genre, I think, was cowboy romances. That was a thing. And cowboy comics and all that kind of stuff.
Is that what it was? So, like, romance comics and maybe horror comics would have been later, I think, right? Even in the 50s, probably.
Yeah, horror comics was a big thing until the Comics Code, which killed horror comics.
Yes, but I think that before the code might have been the 50s. Maybe I don't really know. Like, I don't know if you guys know the real horror comics heyday. Right. Might not have existed in the 30s. I don't really know.
I like vampires and things like that were always popular. So
okay.
Yeah, vampires were some of the first pulps.
It must have been, right? Because they were theatrical. I've read about the theatrical productions of Dracula. They were very successful even before the movie.
Yeah, like Varney the Vampire was the biggest smash for vampires in the 1900s, because it came about with the rise of the penny dreadfuls and these cheap books you would get for riding on trains, because train travel was suddenly a big thing. So you get those, and Varney the Vampire was the vampire, and then Dracula came about in 1910 kind of thing, maybe late 1800s, and so that was influenced by that. Well, damn it, there were so many more pop culture things we could talk about that I can't really think of at the moment. Oh, actually, before we go, I was just watching this terrible film called Amsterdam. It's just come out. It's a 2022 film starring Christian Bale and various actors, Margot Robbie. So freaking boring and badly written, but it's set in the 1930s after the First World War. And it's all about the stuff that sort of became popular in the meantime. Sorry, when I say popular, I mean it's like stuff that has sort of come out in blogs and all that kind of stuff more recently about the 1930s that really wasn't popular back in the day. Like plastic surgery, reconstructive surgery for people who've been terribly wounded during the war. All that stuff was hidden in past times. They didn't make a big thing about it, but now we kind of focus on this stuff because we're more prurient in our interests and we're fascinated by, grotesque things and injuries and all that kind of stuff. So this film focuses a lot on that stuff, but it's terribly boring. I
Yeah,
don't
did look
recommend
like this.
Amsterdam.
Yeah.
Have you seen it?
No, I saw the preview and it put me off. Yeah, I didn't like it.
Yeah.
I only have time for previews now, Oz.
Yeah, well, that's all you need.
Yeah.
And you had a very good impression. All right. With that, I think Tance is getting so hungry she's about to eat her own hair. So
Yes.
before we end
since
up with
the
a bald
30s.
Tance.
Come on, let's do this.
We should wrap it up.
All right, let's sing our closing song and then get out of here. Oh,
No,
wait, we
no,
don't have a closing
you sing your closing song. I don't have one.
Hidey, 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 ho. Tance was a low down hoochie coocha.
All right, we'll quack you later. Whatever our sign off is. We don't have a sign off.
We don't really
Quackulator.
have a sign off. We
Take
just
care.
need to go.
Isn't
Yes.
that what you used to calculate
What's this?
things? A quackulator?
I think so.
All right. Bye-bye, people. Thank you very much for listening to
Bye.
Quackcast number 613. I've been Ozone Ocean. And with
I've
me
been
has
Ben.
Tance.
And
been
thanks.
paying.
Bye.
You've been suffering.